this kind of this, it's a controversial field, and we're all trying in our own way to kind of promote information and knowledge. And with that, we want to promote information and knowledge around detransitioners. You can see the poll up there. And I think it's often called the minority within the minority. People don't know much about the detransition experience. They don't know the numbers. They don't know why people are detransitioning. We don't know so many different things about detransition. It's quite frightening, if you ask me. So I'd love if you took part in our poll and read the quote here by Michelle, the detransitioner, before we speak any further. So I'm going to go ahead with just a couple of slides of my own around detransition, because I think it's quite important to kind of bring in the two detransitioners who are going to speak. They're Laura and Michelle, and they're both phenomenal speakers. I've heard them both speak before, and they're really, really worth listening to. So what is detransition? Detransition is when a person who is medically transitioned returns to live as their birth sex. It is an incredibly controversial issue at the moment, but frankly, I would say it's a much more distressing issue than it is controversial. And I think those among us who have integrity and want to help need to grapple this. We need to figure out, why are people detransitioning? What leads a person to detransition? What are the issues? And when we look at, let's say, Detrans Reddit, when I started following Detrans Reddit, it was in 2019 and there was less than 1,000 members. And now there's something like 27,000 members, or 27.6. It says 27.9 thousand members. So there's less than 1,000, 3 or 4 years ago. Now, these are not made up only of detransitioners. And there'll be people like myself, mental health clinicians who are interested. There would be parents. There would be people who are lost in transition, who are thinking about detransitioning, who would be also members. So it's not only detransitioners, not by a long shot. However, I do recommend you have a look in it, because I think it's a very informative Reddit. It's an informative and shocking platform. So I really do advise people go on to Detrans subreddits, and they'll see what I'm talking about. This chart was from a demographic survey taken just in the last few weeks. And if you see what the questions that were asked was basically, why did you detransition? And 82% of those who took it on this Detrans subreddit, they said realized gender dysphoria was related to other issues, 82%. Then concerns regarding health was 53%. I know I work a lot as a psychotherapist, I work a lot with detransitioners, and there's a lot of concerns around health. There's a lot of medical health complications. And also for me, by far and away, that 82% is exactly what I see in my clients, which is they have huge other issues that haven't been addressed, that were dismissed or disregarded by mental health clinicians that were supposedly, apparently helping them. And instead they helped them to medically transition, and they dismissed their other very profound emotional challenges that should have been addressed. 40% say that the transition didn't help with their gender dysphoria. A lot of people find that transition focuses the gender dysphoria and creates more gender dysphoria because you become more intense about the issue. 36% found alternatives to deal with gender dysphoria, body grounding work, mental health work. Unhappy with the social changes that took place, 38%. 44% unhappy with the physical changes. They didn't like the physical changes that were brought about as a result of medical transition. Some people aren't happy with, I think I'm glad Ernie, was it? Or I think it was actually Dr. Paul Hrues brought it up. The intense distress around chronic severe acne isn't stated enough. I had acne as a child myself, and that's a huge issue around testosterone that needs to be talked about. And as well as that, male pattern balding is a big, huge issue. And then there's other physical changes that distress people, the medical complications around their surgery, unhappiness around their surgery. Lack of support from physical surrounding was 4%, so that wasn't a big deal in comparison to the other ones. Financial concerns, 11%. Discrimination or transphobia, 7%. Bigger issue would be the comorbid, mental health issues related to gender dysphoria. So that would be the things that I was talking about earlier, and so was Julia Mason, the pediatrician, ASD and ADHD and issues like that. And change in political views or beliefs, 33%. So that was an online survey. Somebody mentioned earlier, I know in the Q&A, I was having a look at them, and please do keep on putting in your questions, and we will address them soon as the detransitioners have spoken. But somebody said, why didn't we use US statistics? The fact is, it's very difficult to get a centralized statistic for US. And so sometimes we're using somewhere like Sweden, where we can get very reliable, specific whole country stats. And it's less concentrated because it's not state by state, and it's more a bigger picture, and it's a better and it's a more reliable picture. So again, the medical, this is again from the trans subreddit, the time before medical transition. So 25.8%, it took over 5 years before they decided to medically transition. Then 4 to 5 years was 8.6%. 3.4 years is 6.5%. I'm finding it difficult to follow this. 2 to 3 years was 15%. 1 to 2 years is 18%. So you can see that like over 5 years seems to be the big number there. And so it's something to be quite conscious of, that it takes some time to decide to medically detransition. And these people are very vulnerable. They need a lot of gentle compassion. They need a lot of empathy. We as mental health professionals, or if you're working with people in college, we need space for the detransitioners and to give them some sort of mental health resources. I've noticed in the campuses around the world, and in the US and in Canada especially, there is no space for the detransitioner. Where is the detransitioner? I know one of the detransitioners that will be speaking later, Laura, is in college. Where is the space? Where is the time? Where are the resources? Is there much money going for the detransitioners in colleges? Are they getting the resources? Are they getting the kind of therapeutic space? Are they being acknowledged? Is their experience acknowledged? You know, some people say the LGBTQ should add a D into the acronym. Many detransitioners say, no, thanks, I don't want to be in that acronym, but I do want to be recognized. I do want my experience recognized. I don't want to be dismissed. A survey of 100 detransitioners, this is a peer-reviewed study that was released a couple of months ago. 55% said they didn't receive an adequate evaluation from a doctor or a mental health professional before starting transition. So 55% believed they didn't receive adequate care from their mental health professional. I know I've heard Michelle, who's a detransitioner who's going to speak in a few minutes. She spoke very, very well in Detrans Awareness Day on the GenSpect webinar. She spoke very well about it, and she gave a brilliant presentation about how the medical field, they failed her. The medical health professional failed her, medical and health professional. And only 24% of respondents informed their clinicians that they had detransitioned. So if you work in a clinic, if you work in a gender health clinic, and you don't know whether there's any detransitioners, be aware that 76% aren't returning to the clinics to tell them that they've detransitioned. And so if you have a high number of loss to follow up in your respondents, it's very, very likely that some of them will be among the 76% who don't return to the clinic and don't tell the clinic about their detransition. This is a really important figure that people need to know about. So that, that's more of the same, just about the numbers around the Detrans Reddit, you know. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and what I'm going to do now is welcome the detransitioners. I'm not sure which person is going to speak first, but I want to talk to you about Michelle and Laura, both biological females who transitioned to male and then back to female again. In case you're not familiar with the word detransition, as I said earlier, somebody who medically transitioned in some way, maybe hormones, maybe surgery, and then they decide that transition is not for them, and they'll go back to living as their natal sex. I've just been told Michelle will be first, and Michelle is sure, and Laura will be sure to offer wonderful insight into their journeys. I've heard them both speak, and they're both phenomenally compelling speakers. And maybe, you know, there's over 350 people registered here. from over 170 colleges and campuses around the USA and Canada. I don't know of any resources from colleges and campuses around the USA or Canada that are taking into account that there are needs for detransitioners. I'm hoping that some of the colleges and campuses that are in attendance here today, some of the 170 that are represented here today, will start to take into account the needs of detransitioners. Will start to be kind of helpful to these people and realize that they need resources too, they need attention too, and they need recognition, acknowledgement, and a kind of a fair reception when they speak. So Michelle, you're all ready. I've spoken too much. You can work away.
Okay. Share my, okay. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm here to speak in my capacity as someone who detransitioned. I'm going to basically go sort of through my life story and give a profile of one type of person that may pursue transition, someone who didn't experience any type of gender dysphoria until young adult years. Sorry, my PowerPoint has frozen on me. Here, I'm gonna go back. Okay, so in my childhood, I would have been considered a gender non-conforming person. So when I say that, I mean, I didn't like wearing dresses. I was doing tomboy activities, things that would be considered something a tomboy would do, physical activities outside, climbing trees, playing sports. When I was a little older, collecting Pokemon cards, playing video games. These are things that I mostly saw boys doing, not so much girls, and role-playing as male characters. But psychologically as a child, I also had a high need for control, which would mean I really wanted things to go my way. And if they didn't go my way, then I would get really upset. I just needed to be, it was very particular. And that leads into the next point, which is that I was very emotionally reactive. It was very easy to make me angry, very easy to get me to start crying, etc. And finally, the third point that I added is that I had a lot of body-focused repetitive behaviors. Now, those three ways that I've described myself, that's not how I would have described myself as a kid or how other people would have described me. They would have described me as bossy, or in a good situation, they might say I had leadership skills. And they'd also point out that, you know, the fact that I was so reactive, that's why I was getting bullied. So, but that's what it led into, essentially, is that those body-focused repetitive behaviors were things like picking my nose, chewing my nails, licking my lips, etc. So having all those things together, it turns out that a lot of people don't really like bossy kid with weird habits who is really easy to like tick off. So I became a target for bullying. And over those years, pretty much every single day, I was having these messages put into me that I'm gross and I'm ugly and nobody likes me. So into adolescence, I started experiencing depression. I had very few friends. I was self-harming when I was in my mid-teen years, although the very first time I self-harmed, I was 11. But also going on in adolescence was a little bit of exploration of gender. So where I was a tomboy when I was younger, I was trying to explore traditional femininity, so wearing skirts and trying makeup. But even so, femininity felt really foreign to me. And also during these years, I was starting to date. I had relationships mainly with older men. So a lot of the people my age didn't seem to like me, but I noticed that men who were older did seem to like me, which is unfortunate, actually. So my first relationship was with an 18-year-old man when I was 14. And the last relationship that I had in this time period was with someone 4 years older than me, but I was in my last year of high school. And that relationship was very bad. It was very emotionally abusive, very controlling. And in all of those relationships, I had very uncomfortable experiences with sex. So I was being coerced into doing things that I wasn't ready to do. And it just wasn't enjoyable for me at all. So that last relationship, we ended up breaking up in 2008. And after that point, I felt like I really needed to recapture my agency in this relationship where I'd been so controlled. So I moved in with my friends and lived in the city of Toronto. And one of the things I did immediately was more exploration of my own aesthetic and of gender expression, but I went in the opposite direction. So I went to more of what I was doing as a child, as a tomboy. So wearing men's clothing, I got interested in men's formal wear. I was cutting my hair short and eventually binding my breasts as well. And coinciding with this was I was finally getting into social media, especially Tumblr. And particularly, I was introduced to social justice activism. And that's the first time I heard about the idea of being transgender. So during that questioning period of time between 2008, 2010, I was introduced to being what trans meant and the idea of gender dysphoria. And I noticed that the way that people spoke about gender dysphoria on social media, they would often refer to really, really common experiences, sometimes even universal experiences, things like, you know, if you feel like you don't fit in, that's gender dysphoria, or, you know, things along those lines, where it felt like it could be something that could really be attributed to anything, but it was being specifically pointed to as being gender dysphoria. And I didn't have any other options. So even though I might have been bullied for many, many reasons as a child, to me, I thought, you know what, maybe because of all of these other reasons as well, I didn't fit in with girls, I didn't like makeup, I was obsessively thinking about my gender, maybe what the real answer is this all happened because I'm trans. So that's sort of how the looking for proof started. There's the way that people talk about trans online is if you think you're trans, you are. There's very little of people telling you that you're not trans or that you should think about not transitioning. It's very, very encouraged to transition specifically. And the example I put there is amitransgender.net, because if you go to that website, what you get is the word yes in big letters. So that's one example of sort of the influence in that regard. And a related, I guess, thing that people would say often is that only a trans person would question their gender this much. So, of course, I was obsessively hyperfixated on this idea that I could be transgender. So I thought, well, this is even more proof. The fact that I'm thinking about it this much itself is proof. So I looked through my history and I thought, you know what, all of these reasons must be why I'm trans. And the more that I thought about it, I think I actually sort of created my own gender dysphoria throughout this, because before about 2008, I didn't want my breasts removed. But as I thought about it more and more and more, then I started to want them removed. And I believe that it sort of almost, it kickstarted it. Anyway, I reframed my whole life thinking, I was trans this whole time. Now, this is a timeline that I made of my medical transition. So in 2010, I told my parents and my family and friends that I believed that I was a transgender man in about February of 2010. And in the summer of that year, I attended a support group for people who were thinking about transitioning. I got a lot of information in that group, but specifically one of the therapists that ran the group, who's also trans, did about an hour meeting with me in which he wrote the letter recommending testosterone for me and referred me to a clinic. So that was how I got to a general practitioner. I didn't go to a gender identity clinic. I went to a general practitioner who prescribed testosterone for me in October of 2010. I had about, it was on my third appointment that they did that for me. And I went through the sort of a modified informed consent model. So I did require letters. The one from that one therapist recommending testosterone, and the other one was from my regular therapist, who I was seeing for non-gender related reasons, who basically said that I was of sound mind to make that decision. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that that therapist had never had a trans client before, so she wouldn't have known what to look for, I don't think. But at any rate, 14 months after that, in January of 2012, I had a bilateral mastectomy. And in 2016, I actually stopped taking testosterone. And the reason, interestingly, it's been brought up, one of the main reasons was acne. I was still having acne 5 years down the road, and it was just terrible. So I wanted to stop. There were other things that sort of came into play. I wasn't interested in masculinizing my body anymore. It just wasn't a priority for me anymore. And another problem was that I was having issues with executive dysfunction, in that I was meant to take my shot every 2 weeks. And the day that I was supposed to take it would come, and then I just didn't want to do it. So I just pushed to the next day, and then the next day, and the next day. So I ended up taking shots every 3 weeks, and I thought, this is probably not good for me. So I stopped. And to coincide with that, I started identifying as non-binary instead of a trans man. And I continued to identify as transgender for another 5 years after that. The year following that, in 2017, I had a psychoeducational assessment because I was attending university and it wasn't going very well. And in that assessment, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. I had other diagnoses as well, but ones that might be relevant are I had significant traits of post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. What I find interesting is the psychologist who did this she didn't question my gender at all. So she just sort of took an affirming approach. My entire 25-page assessment is written with they, them pronouns, etc. But nowhere in there did she say, maybe something about this might make you reconsider your gender identity. Maybe something, maybe one of these developmental disabilities had something to do with your gender. I feel like this is a missed opportunity for her to bring this up with me. But because she didn't, I continued on the pathway I was on, and I had a hysterectomy the following year. Because I had stopped taking testosterone, I kept my ovaries. 2 years after that, November of 2020, is when I detransitioned. And I announced to my family last year in February. And the thing that made me stop, that I decided to detransition, was that now that I had the diagnoses, it took me many years to really look into autism and ADHD and think about them and how each of these things might have affected me. And I look back on it and think, how could you possibly have missed this? This is something that would have been so crucial to the decision that I was making to transition. And it was never offered to me. So this is my last slide. When I came to sort of a form of understanding, and if I had had some type of gender exploratory therapy, this is what I would assume that it would look like, thinking about all of the possible other reasons that I didn't like makeup or dislike dresses. Like, those were sensory issues, actually. They had nothing to do with my gender. And then what you see on here is the blue squares are the things that I had think about before, and the orange squares are just new ideas that I had never thought of before. So, I transitioned, I think, as part of a coping mechanism. It was escapism. I was trying to get away from being female and the parts of it that I didn't like. And, passing helped me with anxiety because I felt like there were less pressures on me. But actually, when I started identifying as non-binary, one of the reasons was because I realized that there are actually gendered pressures, expectations of men as well, that I also didn't fit. So at the end of the day, what I feel like is that I had a complex psychological profile. And for some reason, for whatever reason, none of this was important to the people that assessed me. Enough that I didn't learn that I had autism or ADHD until 7 years after I was on testosterone, and until I had already permanently lowered my voice, had already gotten rid of my breasts, etc. And I think about all of the people, I have a lot of trans friends, and a lot of them also are young adults. A lot of them are young women, and they all have as well psychological profiles that are very complex. And for me personally, it's hard to believe that they were essentially born transgender, born in the wrong body, than to believe that they have similar things happening to them than I do. So that's basically where I'm going to stop. And that's my story.
Thank you, Michelle. That was fascinating. It's a shocking story, and you say it so well. And I really think that anybody who works in mental health needs to stop and pause when they hear that story and realize, hang on a second, do we need to kind of let this be known? I want to say, before I go on to the lovely Laura, who has an equally shocking story, and I think also needs to be heard. And I think what we need to do, I suppose, as a mental health professional myself, is we need to start acknowledging this possibility and bringing it into our mental health care and making sure that we're aware of it. Yeah, do you remember I put up this slide and I got it wrong? So somebody has sent me the correct one just before we go on to Laura, and it is really worth listening to Laura. We'll just have a quick look at this. So from the DTrans Reddit, yeah, there was over 5 years. It took, 25% of the people took over 5 years. And then let me get the numbers right. So 4 to 5 years was 8%, 3 to 4 years was 6%, 2 to 3 years was 15%. Then it gets interesting. 1 to 2 years, 18%, 6 months to a year, 16%, and under 6 months is 25. Is 25? Wow, 25%. So 9.7 is over 5 years. I'll check back on that to make sure that the colors are right, because I said it wrong there, and I'm sorry to make a mess of it. It's such an extraordinary piece of information. It is worth me checking it out. So I will go back after Laura's talk to make sure. But it looks to me that like under 6 months is 25%. Under 6 months, whoa, it's phenomenal. I do know that medical detransition has become a huge hot issue in the medical health field and in the transition world, and we need to learn more about it. We need to learn a lot more about it, and we could do that by listening to people like the lovely Michelle and Laura. So Laura, would you like to, I'll stop my share. Laura, would you like to take over now? And I'll stop my video.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for having me here. My name is Laura, and I actually am in college right now. I'm almost not, though. I'm going to be graduating in May with my art degree. And as cool as that is, I'm here to talk about my experience with transitioning and detransitioning as a young person with severe mental health issues, and the trauma that I've experienced going through these identity crises and the unnecessary medical interventions that I've had while being a college student. So to give some background, there's a lot of similarities between what Michelle talked about in her childhood and with mine too. My whole life, I've been an unconventional person. I would say I was gender non-conforming, but I was just non-conforming in general, and gender happened to be part of it. In hindsight, I've realized that I never really fit into any box or social group. I was weird, sensitive, artistic, but I really struggled to make friends, and I got depressed very early on. I went through puberty starting around age 10. And I had polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I believe severely affected my hormonal and emotional regulation. And I don't think this was addressed today, but I will add that polycystic ovarian syndrome seems to be very, very prevalent among the trans population, is what I've noticed. And certainly for myself, it was an issue. I was diagnosed at age 11 with an autism spectrum disorder, PDD-NOS, which stands for pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which is a very quirky way of saying there's something off about you, but I don't know what exactly. It's a catch-all term for someone exhibiting signs of autism, but not enough to meet the criteria for Asperger's. So needless to say, I never really got help for that because, you know, what even does that really mean? It's not even a diagnosis anymore. So at 12, I was diagnosed with major depression and anxiety. And around the time of puberty, I started experiencing verbal and emotional abuse from family, which later contributed to me having a lot of mental health issues and even PTSD, which wasn't diagnosed until I was 22. So from age 11 and on, my self-esteem, hopelessness, suicidal behavior, destructive behavior, and overall quality of life just got increasingly worse. Since around age 14, I didn't feel safe in my own body or mind due to the emotional abuse. And I struggled with suicide and felt my life was worthless and that I was unlovable, helpless, and hopeless. And that just got worse every year. When I was 15 and a sophomore in high school, I started coping with my mental health issues through alcohol, weed, drugs, and cutting. Initially, the drugs helped me be less socially awkward and anxious, and I was able to make some friends, which was a huge deal for me. So I did begin to feel a little bit better, started experimenting with self-expression through identity, fashion, and doing creative activities like writing poetry about how I wish I could be loved and existentialism, you know, the good artistic stuff. And although I started having a good social life, none of the trauma had really been addressed or healed. And I continued to get more depressed and hopeless. And I was sort of pathologized as just this depressed person. That was sort of my identity. And yet none of the core issues really ever got addressed. So around this time, I was really, really into self-expression, right? Because I'm very artistic. I started exploring my gender identity, which I'd learned about on Tumblr and in the Gay Straight Alliance at my school. It was a very accepting school. So there was a Gay Straight Alliance, and we learned about gender identities and on Tumblr. And I was very androgynous, right? I was very non-conforming, mostly just wearing like quirky and flamboyant outfits and mostly men's clothes. I never viewed myself as feminine or girly in style, attitude, personality, or behavior. So I started identifying as genderqueer, which to me, I rationalized that as, you know, my gender is just weird. And initially it was a good thing. At first, I loved the identity of androgyny and ambiguity because I was so non-conforming, it seemed to make sense. But as I continued to get more depressed, I really longed to have a romantic and intimate relationships with men and just to be loved in general. I had severe attachment issues, especially with men, and my self-hate and focus on my body and sex characteristics became really volatile. Throughout high school, I had 3 obsessional, limerent, unrequited loves for 3 different gay male friends of mine. They didn't really know they were gay because it was high school and I had attachment issues. So I didn't really know what was healthy or unhealthy. And I was just a teenager as well. So we were sort of hanging out in this artsy stoner nonconformist theater friend group where everyone was questioning their gender and sexuality. And that was all fine and good, you know, to have our gender and existential concerns and sexuality confusion. But unfortunately, I also had undiagnosed trauma and PTSD, which paired perfectly with my insecurity. And they sort of used me, my friends, you know, innocently enough, but they used me to figure out that they were gay, and they could never really reciprocate the love and attraction that I felt for them. And that made me extremely suicidal. The romantic crises and the sexual rejections, combined with my unstable identity and self-worth, manifested as gender dysphoria, which really was an intense fixation and hatred of my body, gender, sex role, sex characteristics, and just myself in general. I was extremely suicidal, and I felt hopeless that I would ever be accepted, loved, appreciated, understood, or feel okay about myself just as a person. Although I was suicidal, my mom convinced me to go to a liberal arts college to just figure out some idea of the future, because I was very suicidal. By the time I was 18 and graduating high school, I was very afraid of what might happen. But I did go to college, and while I was in the dorms, I can remember it was a very visceral time. It was a very traumatic time. I was severely suicidal, and all I did was ruminate and have nightly breakdowns about my heartaches and grief and why I was so unlovable, and how much I wished I could just be a gay man instead of this like ugly, weird, straight girl. I was still very obsessed with one of my gay male friends who led me on really badly. It was a real catastrophe. That relationship was very toxic. But I just romanticized the idea of gay masculinity, and how if I were a gay male, I could still be this type, have the personality that I had, right? So artsy, sensitive, dramatic, and melodramatic, and emotional, humorous, intense, non-conforming, but also be taken seriously by other people and understood in a way that I had never been as myself. And I thought that's somewhat because I'm a woman. I felt that a gay man could be able to love and be loved by men. So that's my very like black and white sort of view of that, with my attachment issues and being in a suicidal state. Gay men get to love men and be with them and have sex with them, and also be their sort of, true selves. They get to be all these things. And I want both of those things, but I can't seem to be accepted or have relationships or do either of those things. And I just suicidally ruminated on that. I felt like the ideal form of human for me, based on my personality and interests, especially sexual interest, was to be a gay man. So although I was not enthusiastic about the prospect of being a gay trans man, like I really didn't want to be trans, which is sort of a very different attitude that you normally might hear. I didn't want to be trans. I did think of it as a mental disorder. I did think of it as a condition, but for me, I'd been so medicalized already. I just thought, all right, well, I'm just broken. I'm just mentally ill like that. That's just another disorder to add to the list. So, I don't want it though. I wish I didn't have any of these problems, but I think I do have this condition of gender dysphoria. But I felt like being a gay trans man, it was something besides killing myself, basically, as this miserable loser of a woman in person that I felt that I was. So I came out as trans in my second semester of college when I turned 19. I was accepted by my friends and family. Their opinion of that was that, I'd always just been sort of weird. I'd always been off. I'd been depressed for a very long time and suicidal. And so I sort of, they just sort of accepted like, yeah, that must be the issue, because they didn't really know any better. And I convinced myself that that must be the problem. Because otherwise I just didn't understand why I was so miserable. And at 18, I was seeing a therapist that I liked, a CBT therapist, but she told me that she didn't understand the gender issues and for me to seek out a gender therapist. And the gender therapist I found didn't seem to have much advice for me other than just that my experience was valid. And one day I tried to reschedule an appointment with her, but she just never contacted me again. So I'm not sure what happened with that, but it was very unprofessional. So I'm not sure what she would have said or done differently. I assume just kept affirming me. I tried to see other therapists who said they worked with gender issues, but none of them ever felt like they cared or understood me or provided any help with my mental health problems. They just weren't good quality therapists. I tried dozens of different medications over the years, but none of them ever seemed to have much of an effect. So they said that I had treatment-resistant depression. And so again, that just made me feel like there was just something internally wrong with me that was just so severe that it might never be helped. I felt very helpless and very hopeless. So after ruminating about being trans for 3 years, obsessively, I went to my psychiatrist, who I was getting antidepressants from. I saw her maybe every 6 months, or maybe 4 to 6 months or so. She wasn't my therapist. She was just my psychiatrist. And I told her that I thought I was trans, and she told me that she would look into it. And she basically said, I don't know a ton about it, but I'll look more into it. And then the next appointment, she said that you seem to meet the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria according to the WPATH standards of care. And I told her that I wanted to have top surgery. So I wanted to have a mastectomy to remove my breasts. And so she wrote me a recommendation letter to a surgeon advising him that I was mentally stable and of sound mind, and not suicidal, which is very interesting, because in reality, I was very unstable. I was very irrational. I was very suicidal. So I'm not sure if I only just appeared stable in that 45 minutes because I'm sort of good at talking. And this is another thing about a lot of these people who identify as trans. They're very intelligent. They're very articulate, and they have some level of awareness. But as one of my friends told me at the time, you are the most rational person at being irrational. Like, you can rationalize being irrational just so well. So it's one of my many skills, but I wasn't stable. And I actually admitted myself to a mental hospital for suicide ideation within a month of her writing the surgery recommendation letter. In the same month, I spoke to a transgender professor at my university who was teaching a sociology of sexuality class. She was a female to male trans man. And I just sort of lamented to her about being trans and how I didn't, how miserable it was. And she told me that, because I was talking about a lot of sexual insecurity, she told me that her sexual insecurity was solved by wearing a strap-on dildo, and that I could get testosterone for free at an informed consent clinic in another state. So that's actually where I learned about getting the testosterone. And so I visited the clinic, and I told them just the rundown of my mental health issues, because I'm very forthcoming. I'm, somewhat autistic, or whatever you want us to call that. So I'm very, blunt and very upfront about it. So I told them everything, including being suicidal, but within an hour, they gave me the testosterone. And I was doing so badly right after I got out of the mental hospital. I took a semester off college, where my self-destructive behaviors really escalated on the testosterone. It was really, really bad. It was a terrible drug to be on. And in that time, I booked an appointment for top surgery for a mastectomy, where the surgeon required 2 letters from my doctor. So I got 1 letter from my psychiatrist and 1 from my general practitioner, who didn't really know me. She just sort of wrote this letter with no questions asked at all. So I gave the letters to the surgeon, and I ended up having the surgery, my breasts removed. And this is when I was 20. And even though I did tell the surgeon that I was feeling suicidal that day, he asked me, like, is it related to the surgery? And I said, no, it's related to other stuff, which was true. It was related to other stuff, but I now see that a lot of like what was going on at the time, the self-destructive behavior, it was related to the surgery too. But he still performed the surgery. And I walked away at 20 with no breasts. And I didn't feel any different after the surgery. In fact, I actually felt worse, because due to being on the hormones, my emotional problems got a lot worse, and I got into a lot of dangerous situations that caused me a lot more trauma. I felt so terrible after the surgery that I actually stopped the testosterone. And after 7 months of taking it, and I told myself that I would go back on to finish it when I became more mentally stable, when that never really happened. So from ages 20 to 22, I experienced a lot more traumas related to coping with all of these things. And finally, when I was 22, I went under a psychological evaluation where I was diagnosed with PTSD. And that's when it clicked for me that all of these things, that like special little something wrong with me that I couldn't really quantify or describe, it was actually PTSD. It was actually complex PTSD from the childhood abuse and all of the subsequent issues that followed it. And around that time, I found stories of detrans women and radical feminists on Tumblr writing about how trauma causes gender issues. And I quickly realized that the transition and the trans identity were just another manifestation of trauma, and that the entire identity had been a maladaptive coping mechanism. It took 2 more years of real mental health treatments such as CBT, DBT, mindfulness, and radical self-acceptance to finally start to heal from the 12 years of living in the trauma state. And since then, I've spent a great deal of time studying other detransition stories, gender issues, psychology, politics, and how and why so many young people, especially girls, are identifying as queer and transgender, and is what we talked about a lot today. In retrospect, my case was really similar to was what I call the archetype of the archetypal FTM, the quirky, sensitive, artistic, weird girl. And also it could be a boy too, but mostly girls. So it's this type of, it's very autistic. But it's an archetype. If you want to even break down autism, you break away from the label, that's sort of what it is. Quirky, artistic, sensitive, weird people. And in retrospect, my case was an obvious example of how abuse, autistic traits, identity confusion, attachment problems, undiagnosed trauma, and the cultural norms skewed me into a trans identity. And what is so obvious to me and other detransitioners beyond our personal narratives are the consistent themes of medical malpractice, just lazy psychotherapy, hot button activism, and emotional neglect offered by therapists, doctors, health clinics, professors, family, friends, and onlookers, all failing to help disturbed young people who are crying out for help with their gender identity issues. I had always spoken candidly and openly about my thoughts, as irrational as they were, to anyone who would listen, because I was in desperate need of guidance, of a safe adult figure. And I was just always met with blank looks or shrugs or placating affirmations of being valid and other generic mental health advice. I can see now that what I really needed was to be convinced that I was worthy of love, as I was, and working towards better self-love and self-respect. But instead, I was affirmed that there was just something wrong with me that was preventing me from being happy, and maybe that was because of having a female body. So my synopsis now is, it's a disgrace to scientific medicine, nuanced psychological analysis, and human compassion to remove the breasts of an autistic 20-year-old girl because she hated herself and didn't know what she was doing in the midst of a traumatic crisis. I take responsibility for my own self-neglect and have spent far more time mourning my own self-disrespect than maltreatment from anybody else. But I also look to people in positions of authority like doctors and therapists to guide me in a safe direction and to know better. But unfortunately, it's just the reality that many doctors, therapists, universities, media personalities, parents, teachers, journalists, etc., they don't know better. They're ignorant to the mental health and social crisis that young people are facing today. And I believe that gender dysphoria is being diagnosed. It's a label for a myriad of complicated biopsychosocial issues that are being left completely untreated or mistreated using gender affirmation models. And a large part of this is happening on university campuses due to the cultural shift towards progressive inclusivity training and political correctness, which is a well-intentioned but misguided empathy towards marginalization, towards marginalized or unconventional people who, while they are suffering from complicated issues of the human condition that are swept under the rug in favor of gender and sexuality labels. And as Aaron talked about, it's very politically motivated versus medical. It's not compassionate or progressive to encourage a generation of young people that if they are depressed, feeling insecure about their bodies, don't conform to gender stereotypes, or just going through the process of puberty and development, that they must have a medical condition that requires interventions. That in my case, in the experience of many others I know, are left with disfigurements, disabilities of otherwise healthy body parts, and the worst part of all, still untreated root causes of their distress that are now compounded by the trauma of going through the gender transition and detransition process. While I believe that mature and psychologically healthy adults should have access to reasonable body modification, it's unacceptable to allow young people who, as we've discussed here today, their brains aren't fully developed. My prefrontal cortex has just kicked in. I've turned 25 this year, which has been a miracle. And also just time progressing. But that's why the watchful waiting model is preferred. And mentally sick young adults are not competent to give consent, and there's permanent damage being done. And in my case, even though I've worked extremely hard and I'm still working very hard to heal a lot of my wounds, there's certain things that I have to accept. Like if I ever have children, I won't be able to breastfeed them. So that's a really important thing. I can never sexually bond with someone using the body that I should have had. I'm missing out on some really crucial things, body parts. And I have permanent reminders carved into my skin of just how much I hated myself and how lost and confused I was in the past. And I hope that people here will consider the nuances that young people and students might be presenting with via the gender issues and offer more substantial mental health resources and understanding. And just my plug here, if anyone is interested to learn more about my story or work, I am an artist and a writer and a podcaster, and I do other stuff. And so if you're interested in that, I can provide links, but that's my story.
Would you like to say where people can find you? Thank you, Laura, that was amazing. Go on, tell us.
Yes, you can find me at funkgod.com or my Substack, Funk Life, or you can just email me at laurabeckerofficial@gmail.com. Thank you.
There are a couple of questions here for you, Laura, so I might start. That was really powerful and really, really, really fabulous. There's two questions here, and I think they're both interesting, so maybe we'll just ask them. One is, are those your words you're reading, or are you reading text from some other source? If so, what is this source?
The source is my own mind. Yeah, I did write that. It's my little speech.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And the other one I thought was really interesting question. I think your insight into autistic archetypes is so valuable. Do you think autism is a causal factor in trans identity or a coexisting experience?
That's really interesting. I think it does tend to be more causal, but I think it can definitely be comorbid. But I really do think that if you strip away like the vast majority of, if you stripped away all of the autistic traits, you'd be left with very few traits in many of these cases that would actually be something else. So I think it's more causal.
Okay, thank you very much. You got some lovely comments there about your story. Both of you do, Michelle and Laura. Yeah, good writing, it really is. You know, there's an interesting, I'm just going to open it up anyway to everybody, some questions. So if everybody wants to join in, first of all, I'm going to just read out a comment and then we'll go to some more of the specific questions. Not exactly a question, but what you said, Laura, ring bells for me about university campuses. They know they have a mental health crisis and it just keeps getting bigger. They're overwhelmed. It seems possible they're latching onto affirming gender identity as one measure they can implement that is promoted as being 100% right on and effective and gives them a domain which they feel like they are getting it right. Maybe the question would be, do you have any ideas how to approach people in institutions who don't want to hear they might be wrong? So maybe Laura or anybody want to come in with that question? It's a really good point. I think it's so, we mental health clinicians we can feel overwhelmed because we're not getting it right, or that we're not doing it right, or that we're not getting, you know, the right results from our clients. And so I can imagine the excitement of feeling, this one is 100% effective, this one works, give me this one and I'll throw it out. And there you and Michelle, Laura are saying, no, it didn't work for me. What other things could we do, I wonder, we mental health clinicians? Anybody? Maybe yourself, Laura, or anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing we can do is just tell the truth. And I mean, my approach is always just tell the truth, share, real world accounts of what's going on and talk about, just to emphasize the mental health safeguarding. It's one, like there's a political angle to it, but there's the mental health issue angle of it. And I think a way to approach it is just to say, like, there are a lot of people who are saying that this hurt them, it didn't help them, like, is this effective? A lot of what we're saying today, we're all kind of talking about, like, are there other options? More so approaching it in a way like, this is, messed up and wrong, and, but more in a political way, but more so saying, or do we want to help young people? Do we want to look at how they're developmentally immature and how do we want to help them? So I think just approaching it from more of a mental health, like a psychological perspective versus a political perspective.
I hear you. There's another question, so I'm just going to leave you on here for a sec while I get to it. I want to point out that we will be finished by half. We have ran on. We're not in the business of rushing or silencing detransitioners because, my God, they don't often get to be heard. And I thought Michelle and Laura were so phenomenal. It was essential that we ran on. And I hope people will understand that if they have to go, they can go. And certainly there will be a recording so they can access the Q&A later. So this question, Laura, it was kind of to you, and I think it was really good too. Laura, if your doctors or therapists had tried to question you further about your identity and traumas, how open would you have been to working through these things rather than forging ahead with your transition? Could your mind have been changed, or were you set at that time on transitioning? What would have worked for you from a therapist? And I love this question because this is somebody who's saying, come on then, what can we do better? And I'd love if Laura answered it, and then Michelle, if you're around, if you were willing to come in either with her or afterwards, I'd be delighted.
Yeah, so the thing is that when I entered therapy, I really was approaching it with maybe even a little more of a rational mind than some people would. Like, I really acknowledge, like, I do think this is a mental disorder. I want treatment for it. And the kind of tragic thing is that I went to see all these different people, but none of them actually provided me with mental health treatment. They all were just like, okay, like, you're trans, so that, whatever you want to do, whatever you feel is right. It's very client led, but it kind of, but not in a way, that it's a healthy way. And so I definitely was open to hearing a perspective. But the thing is that when it comes to therapeutic work, it really depends on the relationship that you have for any issue, the relationship that you have with the client and therapist. So unfortunately, I just never felt like I could really trust these people. I mean, I was very forthcoming, I'll tell my story to anybody as I like to talk, but, I didn't feel like they really understood where I was coming from. So in terms of what would have worked, I definitely was open to a different perspective, but it would have had to have been someone working with me over a long period of time and really building that rapport with me and showing me that it's a safe place. As I kind of described, there was that one therapist who, I did like her, but she was like, I don't really know, you should see somebody else. And I didn't like that. And there was another one that just never got back to me, so it really is about consistency, and really establishing trust so that the patient can be vulnerable enough to admit if they have some cognitive distortions, and be open to other possibilities. So from those therapists, they probably wouldn't have been able to do anything because they didn't seem competent, or they just didn't seem, we didn't get along, I guess. I don't know.
Got it. And Michelle, would you like to come in?
I missed the question. I know it's about therapy.
Yeah, I'll ask you it because it is worth it, because I thought it was really important. If your doctors or therapists had tried to question you further about your identity and traumas, how open would you have been working through those issues rather than forging ahead with your transition? Could your mind have been changed? Or were you set at that time on transitioning? What would have worked for you from a therapist?
So I've said before, I've been asked this question before, and what I've said in the past really is that it's really hard to say what would have changed my mind, and whether it would have or not, because I know the type of person I was. In my presentation, I talked about how I have like a high need for control, and I was still like that. Even a few years ago, I was still like that. And so if I had my mind set on something and I wanted to transition and that's what I wanted to do, then looking back on it, yeah, there is a part of me that thinks, yeah, I would have just gone ahead with it anyway, and nothing could have stopped me. But at the same time, I didn't know that I had autism. I didn't know I had ADHD. There were other parts of that psychological assessment that really, really shined light on things. I was, this isn't like a real diagnosis, but I have a slow processing speed, which just basically means I have difficulty sequencing ideas and then sort of putting them all together definitely in my head specifically. I'm much better at writing it, which is why I had the PowerPoint. But yeah, it's so hard to say. And the other part is the culture, is that outside of the land of professionals, I was online with all of these people who were saying, oh, all of these professionals just don't want you to transition. They don't actually care about you. They're transphobic. They'll do anything to prevent you from getting it. So of course there's a part of me that goes, oh, that just makes me want it even more. So it's really hard to say. And in my mind, ideally, I would have been screened for all these mental health diagnoses that could have been potential comorbidities. Ideally, even if my therapist decided that I was of sound mind to transition, she would have continued questioning me about certain ideas that I held about myself. Because I mean, my therapist was a CBT therapist. So I could have come to her and said, I think I'm trans, and she could have taken a CBT approach with that and said, okay, well, what's the evidence for this? What's the evidence against this? And we never did anything like that. So I think there are places where people could have done something more, but it's really, really hard to say, could you have been stopped?
Okay, that was really well answered. Thank you. I want to keep the two of you on. I'll be shot by everybody, but I do want to ask you this question, and it's come up, if you don't mind. Laura and Michelle, thank you so much. Would the fact that regret rates aren't known have affected your decision to take any of the steps? That is, the really low, stats that are quoted, they're flawed. For example, a very often quoted one is 1% have detransitioned. We've all heard that stat. Anybody who really knows the research knows that it is a very flawed stat, and 36% of the people left the treatment at the centre. So, it's all this loss to follow up, and then 75% aren't contacting it. So would the fact that regret rates aren't known, would that have affected your decision to take any of those steps?
I mean, at the time that I transitioned, there was very few you know, there was very little. I think there's a lot more awareness of detransition now. So the fact that, you know, if I'd known that the rates were higher, I think, yeah, I think it might have influenced it. At the same time, I was really desperate for something to work. So I had a lot of magical thinking going on, about like, I really need this. So, you know, it's sort of difficult for the person who is irrational to then seek out evidence purposefully that's going to refute their irrational fantasy. But if there had been evidence, like clinicians or safeguarding people knowing, you know, those rates were actually higher, I think that would have helped, because then they could have told that to me or talked through it with me. But again, it is difficult for like the irrational person to, you know, seek out evidence that destroys their false belief.
I know. We all have to be aware of the danger of magical thinking, I think, clinicians and clients alike. Michelle, do you want to answer that? And then I'm going to go on to some of the other questions.
Yep. So when I was in that support group for people who were thinking about transitioning, there was actually, I did say that I think I said that there was very little talked about detransition and regret and so on, but they did quote a stat. They gave the statistic that 1% regret surgery. And they compared that to knee surgery and said it was something like 40%. And I think that being given that statistic actually it made me think I'll never be one of those 1%. It's so unlikely that I'll ever be one of those 1%. So if someone had told me that the statistics were unknown, I think that it would be a little different. First of all, I feel like knowing about the potential for possibly detransitioning or possibly regretting something would certainly deter it a little bit. And I wanted to really quickly, because I saw the question that, you know, why are you rejecting the regret rates? And because I've done so much looking into it myself. And the reason that we reject the regret rates that say that 1% regrets it is because of that giant loss to follow up. So they'll say, you know, there are it was all those things you mentioned earlier. 76% don't go back to the clinicians and tell them that they're detransitioning. The fact that, you know, having genital surgery and regretting that is such a different psychosocial experience than having knee surgery and regretting it because you're still in pain. It's very different when the validation of your identity is all wrapped up in it. And as we know that a lot of these studies about regret and detransition, they all use different definitions. What does detransition mean? What does regret mean? And stuff like that. So it's hard to say how many people actually regret it or not.
I want to follow up on that because it is a very important point that 1% is a flawed stat. It isn't a good statistic. For starters, it was very much taken back when Erin Kimberley spoke about it, when there was a huge amount of safeguarding, not very many people were transitioning. And there was a huge amount of kind of gatekeeping to stop people from transitioning so as to sort out like kind of potential detransitioners. That's one of the points. And the second point, which you've just said, Michelle, which is the actual criteria to call it detransition change depending on the study. And so, for example, a very well-known study about detransition regret rates wouldn't have Kira Bell, and wouldn't have Laura as actual criteria for detransition because of the very strict criteria of you have to detransition within this time frame. You have to have undergone genital surgery, and if you haven't, you're not in this. You're not a detransitioner. So when you change the criteria around what is detransition, and if you make it very specific, you can effectively change the numbers. And so we don't know. That's all. The position of GenSpect is we don't know. The position I think you have is, Michelle and Laura, is we don't know the numbers. The only one that we know of recent times would be the study from Lisa Littman, which was released last November, which is 76% aren't going back to the clinics. That was only 100 detransitioners. Many more studies have to be done on this subject. It's a new cohort, new numbers, and we have to give them the respect, the kind of humility to know that we don't know. I want to ask, I better go.